What's up everyone, I'm Eldridge, and wouldn't you know, World of Warships has officially released. Now by calling it an official release, Wargaming has basically said, this game is ready. And because you do not get to have your cake and eat it, I'm now going to ramble on for a while about why I think the game is not ready for release. I would like to make it very clear that these are my opinions. This is what I personally expect from a finished game. Obviously, the kind of things that you expect from a finished game are very personal and very subjective. Some people are fine with very bare bones games and are even willing to put money into that. Other people expect more feature-rich games. In the end, it really all depends on your sense of value. Now, of course, this is a free-to-play game, but then again, there are so many free-to-play games out there that I kind of have to compare World of Warships toward, that saying it's a free-to-play game really doesn't work as an excuse, because there are other free-to-play games that do so much more even at release. So my first category of complaints goes toward what I consider to be missing features. I don't think it's fair to say that the game is bare bones. I think the basic gameplay, the game definitely gets right, in the way that you drive your ship, fire your guns, all of that stuff is fun and is interesting to interact with, and there's a lot of strategy involved. However, there are a few features that I personally consider to be core features that have been sort of implemented into the game code, but they have just not come around to finishing those. And I honestly would have expected those features to be there for launch, namely replays. The way replays work in the game right now, i.e. that you have to activate them through the preferences.xml file manually, that has been the case since alpha. Now these replays are nowhere near finished. They are choppy, they are laggy, the UI jumps all over the place when fast camera movements happen, and replays practically don't work at all for carriers. Not having replays in your game for release is very bad for a lot of reasons. First of all, of course you want people covering your game on YouTube and on Twitch. But without a proper replay system, your game just isn't going to look that good in videos. Half of the games I put up on my channel are from replays, and you can definitely see the difference between games that I record live and games that I record from a replay. Whenever you think, oh, that's a bit choppy or the UI is jumping around weirdly, that's the replay. Or if it works perfectly but has slight frame drops here and there, that's the live version. The second feature that I'm personally missing in this game are clans. I mean, come on, this is a team-based multiplayer game. There is so very little sense of community outside of the official forums and the subreddit, it's almost comical. This game needs a clan system, and it is just mind-boggling that it's not in the game yet. I'm not even asking for a clan wars system, just the capability to make clans in-game and as such have communities inside the game. Whenever I want to interact with other players, I have to get out of the game and go into social media. That is a ridiculous state of affairs. The next thing, and one of the most egregious in my opinion, is that the accounts are not fully shared. It was on many occasions promised to the community that accounts would be fully shared between World of Tanks, World of Warplanes and World of Warships at World of Warships release. Now they held this promise up sort of halfway, in that premium time is indeed now shared between World of Tanks, World of Warplanes and World of Warships, but gold is not. And let's be honest, it is quite obvious why that is, because they would really like you, even if you already have 10 to 20,000 gold sitting on your World of Tanks account, they would really like you to just go ahead and buy some more. So this decision has absolutely nothing to do with any form of implementation problems. This is a pure business decision. And I gotta be honest, I'm a consumer. I don't have to give two shits about what you need to do as a business. If I don't like your business practices, I'm just gonna take my money somewhere else. And in case that wasn't clear, yes, in this case, I definitely do not like your business practices. Next, there are no custom games in World of Warships. Custom games to me are absolutely essential. In a game that has so many different vehicles with so many different stats and so many different interactions, I find it absolutely pivotal to have a mode where I can go into and just test a ship with a friend. He picks a ship, I pick a ship, we just drive around a little bit, shoot at each other and test out certain interactions about the game. That is how you learn a game. Not having custom games at release when the possibility for custom games is in the code of the game and has been since alpha, well, that's just quite pathetic. And then lastly, in missing features, there is no tutorial in World of Warships. Why Wargaming always insists on turning their first 3 tiers into a tutorial, I will never understand. You see, the quality of the gameplay at tier 1 to 3 could actually be pretty good. If it wasn't for this complete lack of a tutorial, and if it wasn't for their complete disregard for game balance, then yes, tier 1 to 3 would actually be quite fun to play. But as it stands, tier 1 to 3 really is just the tutorial, and once you reach tier 4, there's absolutely no reason to ever go back, because those first 3 tiers you will learn nothing. It's just a bunch of new players who don't know what they're doing because they've never been told, and they're left to their own devices and just have to kind of learn the game as they go along, ruining those early parts of the game for anyone who actually likes the ships that are driving around there. Now let's move on to bug and design related problems that the game has to this day. The first one I would like to call out is the loading times. Sometimes when you load into a game, usually the first couple of matches that you play every day, a map that you haven't played on that day will take so long to load that the game will have gone on for 30 seconds before you even get into the game. Now, in a game that sometimes has capture points in the middle of the map, it shouldn't really be that hard to figure out why it's very, very bad to have such long loading times. Now, it has been said by multiple Wargaming employees that installing the game on an SSD pretty much fixes this problem. But my SSD doesn't have unlimited space, and I have other stuff that I want to put on my SSD. How about you just fix your game? Because I have pretty much all my games on an HDD, including The Witcher 3, and your game runs on such ancient tech that it has absolutely no business whatsoever loading longer than The Witcher 3. Next, I would like to talk about the economy above tier 8. Right now, the repair costs, ammo costs, and camouflage costs are so incredibly high above tier 8 that at those tiers, it is practically impossible to make a profit unless you run a premium account. Unless, of course, you're incredibly good at the game. But let me repeat that. Starting at tier 8, it is almost impossible to make a profit unless you run a premium account. Now, anyone who has played World of Tanks before will know that if you just play tier 10 tanks, you will run out of money eventually unless you're really good at the game. Because generally it takes very good games to make a profit, and even then the profit margin is relatively small. And when you lose, you generally also lose a bunch of credits. Now, this is designed so that not everybody just clumps up at tier 10 and people go back to lower tiers to make credits there. And that's okay. But we're not talking about just driving ships at tier 10. We're talking about tiering up from tier 8 to tier 10. And that being practically impossible unless you buy premium. Now, there are going to be white knights who are going to come at me saying, "Oh, but if you expect to play that much of a game without paying, then you are crazy." Well, but if that's the case, then you can no longer claim this to be a free-to-play game. In order for you to be able to make that stupid argument that it's a free-to-play game, it doesn't have to have many features, you can't in the same vein say, "Oh, but you shouldn't expect to play the entire time for free." There has to be a middle way. It has to be possible to at least play the game to max level without spending any money. And you can very handsomely play World of Tanks without spending any money. It's just much harder, but you don't have to be crazy good to achieve it. Everything just takes you a lot longer. But in World of Warships, unless you are actually really good, you are going to have a hard time making credits at all at those higher tiers. And the ships get really damn expensive. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but a tier 10 ship costs 20 million credits. Now, I'm not of course advocating for everything to be completely free. I understand that they have to make money. I'm just saying that the economy at tier 8 and above is overly harsh and has absolutely no reason to be that way. It is so much harsher than it is in World of Tanks, and World of Tanks makes an absolute killing. Then there's the fact that the game launched with only 2 tech trees. Now personally, this doesn't really bother me all too much, but I do realize that this perceived lack of diversity is going to bother some people. Right, now we come to the biggest offender in my opinion. That is definitely the game's balance. Oh boy, is the balance ever out of whack. I've alluded to this a couple of times already, but I really wanted to actually sit down and create some graphs or charts where I can just show you what I mean by the balance not being right. And this right here is what I came up with. So what you see here is a standard line graph. Across you have a scale of the ship's tier, and up you have a scale of the median strength, i.e. the strength that a ship should have at these certain tiers. So as you can see in this first little example, A perfect balance would be if a tier 1 ship has the median strength of a tier 1 ship, and a tier 2 ship has the median strength of a tier 2 ship, and a tier 3 ship has the median strength of a tier 3 ship, and so on and so forth. And I've basically gone through all the ships and gave them a proper map. Now you might recognize that the line I've drawn here is actually the color of the IJN cruisers. And the reason for that is that I personally think IJN cruisers is the most balanced ship line in the game. There are of course some outliers. Tenryu is a little bit stronger than it should be for tier 3, Furutaka is a little weaker than it should be for tier 5, same with the Aoba, Mogami is a bit stronger than it should be for tier 8, and Zao is also a bit stronger than it should be for tier 10. But the differences are pretty negligible, and overall they present a pretty damn good average for the game. Now when we put in the American cruisers, we can already see some differences and why the Americans are not the perfect example for a median strength. The Erie is slightly better than the Hashidate, Chester is slightly weaker than the Chikuma, St. Louis as a cruiser is definitely stronger than the Tenryu, although the Tenryu isn't bad. Phoenix is slightly weaker than the Kuma, Omaha quite a bit stronger than the Furutaka, Cleveland also quite a bit stronger than the Aoba, and from that point on they're all a little bit weaker than their Japanese counterparts. And that is simply due to them pretty much all having the same guns, the same number of guns, very comparable armor, but the Japanese cruisers of course have the advantage of having torpedoes, which the American cruisers do not. Now when we start adding in the battleships, we can start seeing the first skew, and why there were so many complaints about the balance during the beta phase. The first two battleships that were introduced into the game, Kawachi and Miyogi, were always bad. I would honestly say that the Kawachi could be a tier 2 and would be an alright tier 2 battleship. But it happens to be a tier 3 and as such it has no chance whatsoever when you compare it to amazing ships like the Tenryu and the St. Louis. The Miyogi at tier 4 doesn't fare any better. The Kuma is really a very average tier 4 ship and the Phoenix is weaker, but they are still both just kicking the shit out of the Miyogi. And battleships are, according to the rock paper scissors, supposed to be countering cruisers, and they just are not, and that is a big problem. However, then when we come to tier 5 and tier 6, suddenly the battleships actually do keep up quite well with the cruisers. There is a dip at tier 7, there are a lot of really bad tier 7 ships, and the Nagato is no exception. We will also see this with the Colorado. Tier 7 is just a pretty derpy tier in a lot of lines. And it interestingly makes the pretty average Miyoko seem like the god ship. And then at tier 8, everything is pretty close together. Itsumo is a little bit weaker, and then the Yamato at tier 10 is just an absolute monster. Now adding in the American battleships, we can still kind of see exactly the same skew. The South Carolina and Wyoming are horribly underperforming, although the Wyoming is slightly better than the Miyogi. The New York and the New Mexico also a lot closer to the cruisers, New Mexico even being a little bit stronger than some of the other cruisers. But then it just dips down and the Colorado is an absolutely awful ship at tier 7. And then starting from the tier 8, you're pretty much good. North Carolina and Iowa are incredibly strong for their tier, and the Montana is not a bad ship. It is slightly weaker than the Yamato, and it does perform slightly weaker than the Yamato overall, but is still very, very strong for a tier 10 ship. But now we see the real problems with the balance. As you can see, early tier destroyers are incredibly powerful. You could pretty much say that most of the early tier destroyers could be up-tiered by one tier, and they would still be fine. A tier 3 Umikaze would absolutely not be a problem. A tier 4 Wakatake? Sure. A tier 5 Isokaze? That would probably be really balanced. A tier 6 Minakaze? Yeah, maybe. Get rid of the Mutsuki and already you have a lot better of a balance. But then comes the real problem. Beyond tier 5, there is just nothing really happening in the destroyer lines. They don't really get better. They get slightly better torpedo damage and maybe slightly better torpedo range, but really when it comes to torpedo range, everything above 10 kilometers suffers a lot of diminishing returns. Because all you really want to be capable of with your torpedoes is fire them from stealth. And 10 kilometers range is more than enough to fire your torpedoes from stealth. Everything beyond that just increases their reaction time upon spotting and just reduces your chances of actually hitting them, because the chance of them making a maneuver and just going out of the way increases drastically. Also, your torpedo spread increases drastically with the higher ranges. So having those 15 or 20 kilometer ranges really isn't the big advantage anymore. And the other problem with destroyers is that their main stats, i.e. speed, turning circle, rudder shift time, and detection ranges, you know, the things that keep you alive and the things that let you maneuver a lot, they don't get better at higher tiers, they sometimes even get worse. After tier 6 and toward tier 9 and 10, there is a big dip in maximum speed, there is a big dip in rudder shift times and turning circles. Your ship becomes less and less maneuverable, it gets bigger and bigger, but it gains practically no hit points or armor. So you're still as vulnerable as you are at the lower tiers, you're a much bigger target, you're slower and less maneuverable, and you get detected more easily. So what is exactly the advantage of tiering up? Just getting better torpedoes? Well, we already established that the range really doesn't do all that much above 10 kilometers. So it's really just the damage that goes up. But then again, everyone else is also gaining so many more hit points that you have to gain that damage, otherwise your torpedoes would be rubbish. And so honestly, if you would take the 15 long lance torpedoes that are on the Shimakaze and you took those off and you would put them on the Minekaze and then put the Minekaze at tier 10, the Minekaze would be a better tier 10 destroyer than the Shimakaze. That is how bad the progression in destroyers is. Now, whether or not you do well in your destroyers is completely irrelevant. Sure, you can have good games in these destroyers, but they are still worse than all the other classes because there is just no progression. And you're still suffering from all the same problems as the other classes. Like, for example, you're still suffering from the same problem of having a bad economy. And because your earning potential as a destroyer goes down and down and down because you get pushed more and more into this stupid support ship role, your earning potential also goes down and down and down. And such you're gonna lose more money at those higher tiers. It's absolutely stupid, and it doesn't get better when we look at the American destroyers because in my opinion, they're pretty much worse in every category. The Samson isn't even good enough to be a tier 3 ship, and the Wix actually is probably the only tier for tier balanced destroyer in the game. The Clemson slightly overperforms, the Nicholas slightly overperforms, but then with the Farragut it already doesn't anymore. It practically doesn't improve at all when you move to the Mahan. It improves just a tiny little bit when you get to the Benson, and then the Fletcher and Gearing are alright because suddenly you have an acceptable range on your torpedoes. You're still far less stealthy than the Japanese destroyers, and a little less maneuverable, but at least at tier 9 and 10 these American destroyers have pretty decent torpedoes, which does make them catch up with the Japanese destroyers. Now I want to say a few things about the guns, because obviously American destroyers are pretty much reliant on their guns, that's what they are about. And the guns on the Gearing, at first glance, really don't look that bad. You have 6 guns at 20 rounds per minute, wow, that sounds amazing! But the problem with that is, they are still the exact same 127mm guns that you have at tier 5. Name a single ship in the game that does not have its guns improve after tier 5. And well, you're gonna say Japanese cruisers, but that's actually not true, because while the guns don't increase in caliber on the Japanese guns, they do change in type. They get longer range, they get better reload, and the ammunition changes, which also means that at the higher tiers, they even do more damage than the tier 5 variants. So it's not actually true. There's really only one type of ship that does not improve its guns after tier 5, and that is destroyers. But for the Americans, you are definitely using exactly the same guns as you did at tier 5, with the same penetration, the same ammunition, the same damage, and even the range doesn't really increase. Yes, the rate of fire increases, but you're still just spamming high explosive, and you still have to get rather close because your shell velocity is so crap. And all that works together to make destroyers just absolutely terrible at higher tiers. And the real tragedy in the beta was that people would start playing the game and they would then from tier 2 jump into the battleships and say, oh, these battleships are complete crap and destroyers with their torpedoes are completely overpowered. Which, if you look at tier 3 and 4, this is a true statement. Even an Umikaze can easily wreck a Kawachi without so much as blinking. It's not a big deal because the Kawachi is just so bad. And the Umikaze technically should be 1 tier higher, while the Kawachi should be 1 tier lower. And this trend continues up until tier 5, where everything comes a bit closer together. But until people realize that this effect has happened, they've probably already advanced to tier 6. And so you have tier 3, 4 and 5 players sitting on the forums complaining that battleships are underpowered and torpedoes are incredibly overpowered. Which at those tiers is true, but the problem is that they never said Kawachi Miyogi and Kongo are bad and Umikaze, Wakatake, Izokaze and Minakaze are good. They always said battleships are bad, destroyers are overpowered. That is a false statement, as we can very clearly see. The higher you go in tier, the worse destroyers get relatively, and the better battleships get relatively. So you're really just suffering through those first 3 tiers as a battleship captain, and Wargaming once again proving that they only look at stats and listen to people with 50 games played, nerfed all destroyers. Every single patch since the closed beta has started has nerfed destroyers in some fashion. Not just the overpowered low tier ones. No. The overpowered low tier ones used to be much more overpowered than they are now. But they brought all destroyers down, and that has made high tier destroyers so incredibly bad. It's not even funny. Every single change that they implemented has just screwed destroyers over more and more and more. And we're left with this game now where I cannot recommend any destroyers past tier 5. I love destroyers, they're my favorite type of ship in this game. But I cannot tell anyone, play destroyers because they're amazingly fun, because I don't actually believe that anymore. Past tier 5, destroyers are underpowered, frustrating, and you're gonna start losing money at some point because the economy is so shit. Now you may ask yourself, what about carriers? And honestly, my answer is, what about carriers? I made a video a while back, right before the open beta started, that I called the state of carriers. And except for the balance issues with the Japanese carriers that has in the meantime been sort of addressed, I still believe pretty much everything I've said in there. I still think they're not fun to play. And the reason for that is simply still that they load you up with so many frickin' dive bombers. Dive bombers just aren't fun to use, because they're entirely 100% random bullshit. Dive bombers are pretty much the equivalent of artillery in World of Tanks. Yes, when you get a couple of bomb hits, it's really effective and does a lot of damage, but most of the time you just don't hit anything. And this issue is a little bit worse for the Japanese carriers because their squads have fewer planes. And as such, they obviously drop less bombs per squadron, which reduces your chances of actually hitting anything. And so a lot of the time with these planes, even if you manually drop and it's right over the target, which is really difficult because the planes are still so incredibly unpredictable, then it can still happen that not a single one of those bombs hits, even if you have the target perfectly over the ship. Because sometimes they just all deviate to the sides and splash, 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 nothing happens. It's just not fun game design. Torpedo bombers have always been and will always be the most interesting part of playing a carrier because it is all up to you. You choose where to drop your torpedoes, you choose how much lead to give, which target to go for. So if you deal damage with your torpedo bombers, it is completely and entirely your skill that made that happen. And that feels both rewarding and satisfying. Dive bombers is just like rolling a fist of dice and hoping for the best. But when your entire damage relies on rolling a bunch of dice, then suddenly it stops becoming fun. And this is why the American carriers are so unpopular. Because in all their loadouts until the highest tiers, you have an abundance of dive bombers, but only a tiny amount of torpedo bombers. Fighters now have their fancy little ability, but it doesn't really change all that much. It's most of the time still more useful to just outright attack the enemy squadron. And shooting down planes is still not rewarded appropriately. I have seen so many friggin' score screens where people have killed 50, 60, 70 planes in the higher tiers, and the amount of experience they get is just absolutely pitiful. There is simply no point in going for enemy planes. And until that is the case, it's going to make you feel bad to play those fighter loadouts. Because the entire time you're going to think to yourself, why am I even doing this? Why am I wasting my time with these fighters when I could go for torpedo bombers and dive bombers and at least get some experience and some credits? This is another big issue of the game. There are so many things where you could say, oh, this is great team play, like laying down smoke, escorting battleships with fighters, or cruisers escorting battleships to provide air cover, or spotting for your team in a destroyer. But none of these things actually provide any reward whatsoever. By helping your team, you are basically sacrificing the potential of having a good game. And in a game that is built entirely around progressing your account, why the fuck should I sacrifice my own game's potential for my teammates, who I'm never going to meet again, who are probably not even gonna say thanks, just so we win the game and I get to be in the bottom 5 of the team? Fuck that. This game has a lot of issues. Calling a competitive, multiplayer, skill-based shooter game with a balanced grid like this finished is an absolute travesty, and I cannot recommend that anyone spend any money on this game until they actually sit down and fix these issues. That's enough ranting for today. I hope you enjoyed this look at my opinion on the state of the game, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing, and if you have any feedback, leave it in the comments. In the next World of Warships video, we'll go straight back to the replay contest by announcing some of the winners, but until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.